Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the female reproductive system. And I just want to stress again that you need to know the male and female reproductive structures from lab. You need to know those for both lab and for lecture. So there are several medical specialties that I thought I'd mention. One is gynecology, and gyneco means woman, and it's a medical specialty dealing with the diagnosis and treatment of any kind of disease or disorder associated with the female reproductive tract. And then you've got an obstetrician. Obstetrician is a physician who deals with pregnancy, childbirth, and what's called neonatal care. And that means at childbirth, if there's any complications, then an obstetrician would be able to handle those. A pediatrician is who the newborn is turned over to. And that would honestly happen in the maternity ward soon after birth. So a pediatrician picks up a newborn and takes them through the age of 18. So we begin by looking at the ovary. The ovary is the female gonad, and that's where the meiotic process of oogenesis occurs that produces the haploid eggs. The ovary also has cells that make and secrete what are known as the female sex steroid hormones, and that would be estrogen and progesterone. I'll be talking about estrogen and progesterone in more detail in a video to follow where I look at details associated with the menstrual cycle. So just a little bit about spermatogenesis. Spermatogenesis in guys begins at puberty, when a guy is somewhere in the 7th grade, and spermatogenesis continues to make sperm cells from puberty until a guy dies. The situation in females is a little bit more complex. So, meiosis in females is referred to as oogenesis. So, during fetal development, the germ cells in the ovary divide by meiosis to produce immature eggs. And the immature egg cells that are produced in the fetal ovaries are referred to as primary oocytes. Now, at birth, the ovaries contain all of the eggs that a female will ever make. And these are eggs that form during the fetal development phase of a pregnancy. So females are said to be born with their full complement of eggs. And these eggs at birth are in what is called a dormant state. A dormant is a resting state or an inactive state. And we're going to find that these eggs begin to become active at puberty, and then for several decades after puberty. So at birth and beyond, the eggs are associated with structures in the ovaries known as ovarian follicles. An ovarian follicle is the egg surrounded by a single layer, just a shell of epithelial cells. And these epithelial cells are known as follicle cells. Now, the ovarian follicles that form during fetal life and are present at birth form in the outermost region of the ovary. So the ovary, like many solid organs in the body, has an inner portion called the medulla of the ovary, and then an outer portion beneath the surface called the cortex of the ovary. Of course, we talked about the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex, and those terms apply to a number of organs because they're generic terms. So the ovarian follicles that form during fetal life form in the cortex of the ovary and form just beneath the surface. So these would be examples of ovarian follicles consisting of an egg surrounded by a single layer of follicle cells. So it turns out that this is showing the follicles in 2 dimensions, but in 3 dimensions the egg would be completely surrounded by a sphere of follicle cells. There's an event that we'll talk about a bit called ovulation. And ovulation is when the haploid egg moves out of the ovary and into the fallopian tube. Of course, the fallopian tube is also called the oviduct and sometimes the uterine tube. Your lab book seems to prefer uterine tube. I kind of like either oviduct or fallopian tube. Those are my preferred names for the oviduct. So it turns out that across the reproductive lifespan of a female, which is about 40 years, only 450 eggs are ovulated from ovarian follicles that then travel into the fallopian tube. So by the time a female reaches puberty, that's going to be, again, somewhere between the ages of 10 to 12 when kids are in middle school. And when a female reaches puberty, she starts having monthly menstrual cycles. And each menstrual cycle is associated with a phase called menses. That's when a girl is on her period, and there's a bloody discharge from her uterus that we'll talk about in more detail later, that generally is absorbed by a tampon as it flows from the uterus into the vagina. And with each menstrual cycle that again occur about every month, the female will ovulate a haploid egg. And the haploid egg is ovulated from either the right or the left ovary. It's pretty much just random. So 1 month from the right ovary, another month from the left, then the right, and back and forth. So beginning at puberty, the ovaries will ovulate an egg each menstrual cycle. And that happens about once a month. On average, each month or each menstrual cycle, about 800 to 1,000 of the ovarian follicles that didn't ovulate an egg will undergo a dying process called atresia, and they die along with the eggs within the follicle. And that means that every month, one ovarian follicle will ovulate its egg into the fallopian tube, while 800 to 1,000 other follicles will literally undergo atresia and die. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about a period in a woman's life called menopause, which occurs somewhere on average around the age of 52. So let's assume that a girl at the age of 12 enters puberty. At puberty, she starts to have periods and ovulate eggs. And at puberty, there's about 400,000 ovarian follicles. That's all total. That would be 200,000 ovarian follicles per ovary. But females have 2 ovaries, and so that's going to be 400,000 all total. Well, each month, when a female is having a menstrual cycle, 1 egg is ovulated, and upwards of 1,000 other ovarian follicles undergo atresia and they die. And what that means is, because of the atresia of so many follicles each month, a female loses around 10,000 ovarian follicles per year. So a female starts with a fixed number of ovarian follicles, and it's a large number, 400,000 between the two ovaries, but she loses about 10,000 of those ovarian follicles each year. If you start with a fixed number and lose X number per year, then at some point in time you run out of ovarian follicles. And that's the case. After about 40 years, which would be the reproductive lifespan of a female, after about 40 years of losing 10,000 ovarian follicles per year, a female would lose all 400,000 of the ovarian follicles to atresia. And at that point in a woman's life, after 40 years of menstrual cycling, she would ovulate about 400 to 500 times, but lose all of her ovarian follicles. And at that point, she's reached what's known as menopause. And menopause is the point in a woman's life when all of her follicles are gone from both ovaries. So there's no more ovulations. There's no more periods, hence doesn't have to worry about using tampons at all beyond that point. There's no possibility without an ovulation of an egg for a fertilization event to occur, hence she cannot get pregnant. Now once a woman stops having these menstrual cycles, she becomes a postmenopausal woman, past the point of menopause. So here's a little bit on the internal accessory organs. So there are several internal accessory organs beyond the ovaries, which are the gonads, and they include the oviduct, the uterus, and the vagina. So the oviduct is also known as the fallopian tube, and I'll abbreviate that FT, and also known as the uterine tube. Any one of those three names would be okay with me. So you can use oviduct, fallopian tube, or uterine tube. A lot of folks call it the fallopian tube. That's actually a name after an Italian anatomist called Fallopius, who did work, I don't know, hundreds of years ago. So the oviducts have at their ends that project to the ovaries finger-like projections called fimbriae. And those finger-like projections are around the opening into the oviduct. So if this were the opening to the oviduct, these finger-like projections would be around that opening. In fact, just to tell you that it's possible to do this, if I could shrink myself into a really, really tiny person, I'd be able to walk down the length of the vagina, through the uterus, up into the oviduct, and through the opening into the oviduct to do a little dance or something like that on the ovaries. So it's kind of interesting because in females, the abdominal cavity is actually open through the oviduct, the uterus, and the vagina to the outside world. The fimbriae are lined with epithelial cells that are ciliated. And the cilia beat in a synchronated fashion at ovulation to help sweep the egg from the ovary into the oviduct. So the haploid eggs are ovulated or released from the ovary into the oviduct. And the oviduct serves as what's called the site of fertilization. And just to review, and hopefully you looked at the mitosis, meiosis, and fertilization video and read through those notes. But just to review, the haploid sperm will fuse with a haploid unfertilized egg at fertilization to form a diploid zygote. The diploid zygote is the fertilized egg. And once it forms, it divides by mitosis, and as it does, it forms the embryo. After the first mitotic division of the zygote, when you've got 2 cells, that 2-cell stage is the embryo. And that ball of cells gets bigger and bigger, and through embryogenesis, eventually looks like a little person. And after about 8 weeks of embryogenesis, we move to the fetus, and 7 months of fetal life, we end up with a newborn kid at the end of a 9-month pregnancy. So I'll go over ovulation a couple times. We'll talk about it actually again in the next and last video that I'm going to do over the reproductive system when I cover the menstrual cycle. But just briefly, ovulation is the release of a haploid egg from an ovarian follicle in the ovary to the oviduct. So here's an ovarian follicle in the ovary that ruptures or opens up, and the haploid egg is released from the ovary. That event is called ovulation. Once ovulation occurs, the haploid egg then moves through an opening at the end of the oviduct that's surrounded by the finger-like projections known as fimbriae, and the egg goes into the lumen of the oviduct. Within the lumen of the oviduct, assuming there is a sperm cell present, fertilization can occur to form the fertilized egg, also known as the diploid zygote. The diploid zygote, after it forms, divides by mitosis into a developing embryo. And after about 3 to 4 days within the fallopian tube, this ball of cells is 200 to 300 cells in size. And after 3 to 4 days, this ball of cells, the growing embryo, moves out through the opening at the end of the oviduct and into the uterine cavity. The ball of cells that we know as the embryo remains free in the uterine cavity for another 3 to 4 days before it literally embeds or eats its way into the endometrium, and that event is called implantation. An implantation, when the embryo implants or embeds into the endometrium or lining of the uterus, occurs roughly 7 days after fertilization. So fertilization occurs in the oviduct. After about 3 to 4 days, the developing embryo enters the uterine cavity, and after another 3 to 4 days, the embryo will implant or embed itself into the endometrium. Before we leave the oviduct, I was going to tell you about something known as a tubal ligation. And tubal ligation is sometimes referred to as having a woman's tubes tied. So, tubal ligation is the counterpart to a vasectomy. So a vasectomy is a male sterilization procedure that prevents sperm cells from getting through the vas deferens, which has been cut and cauterized to incorporate into semen. So when a guy ejaculates semen after a vasectomy, the semen has the 3 solutions from the accessory glands, but no sperm cells. In the case of a tubal ligation, it's a female sterilization. And what happens is we're going to cut out a section of the oviduct and close it off. So the term ligate means to close off. So a physician would have to go in to the abdominal pelvic cavity and literally cut out a section of each oviduct, because this would be done bilaterally, and then seal off the cut ends. So after tubal ligation, a female still ovulates eggs, And the ovulated egg then would go into the fallopian tube, but it wouldn't be able to go past the point at which the cut occurred. Sperm cells would still be ejaculated into a vagina, swim up the uterus, into the oviduct, but sperm cells can't swim from this direction past the point at which the ligation occurred. And as a result, the sperm and the egg can never get together at fertilization. Hence, this is a woman that cannot have a baby. She can't get pregnant, and as a result, the female is sterile. So the uterus is also known as the womb, and it's the place where the embryo and the fetus develop through a 9-month pregnancy. The uterus, as you know, consists of 3 sections from top to bottom: the fundus, the body, and then finally a constricted region called the cervix. The fallopian tubes come off the fundus, and the cervix attaches to the vagina. So the uterine wall has 3 layers, and beginning from the outside and working in, the outermost layer that you would touch as you touch the surface of the uterus is the perimetrium. The middle layer and thickest layer with a lot of smooth muscle is the myometrium, and myo means muscle. It's the smooth muscle cells of the myometrium that contract at childbirth. Those would be labor contractions to push the baby out of the uterus into the vagina, and from the vagina obviously into the hands of a delivering physician. So the innermost layer is the endometrium. And the endometrium is also known as the lining of the uterus, or the uterine lining. The endometrium is a little more complicated, in my opinion, than the others, and we'll spend more time talking about it and its relationship to the menstrual cycle. So the endometrium consists of 2 layers that we'll ultimately talk about: the stratum basale, which I'll abbreviate SB, and the stratum functionalis, which I'll abbreviate SF. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the endometrium. And the endometrium consists of 2 layers: the stratum basale and the stratum functionalis. The stratum basale is the base layer, or the bottom layer, and it sits on top of the myometrium. I do want you to file away that the basal layer, or stratum basale, is not shed during what's known as menses. Menses is a more technical name for a woman who is on her period. And menses then refers to a bloody discharge phase of the menstrual cycle. And we're going to talk more about that later. So the stratum basale, as we'll see, is stimulated by a steroid hormone from the ovaries called estrogen to divide by mitosis, and it then grows or thickens into the functional layer. So, moving to the functional layer. The functional layer grows out from the basal cells when they are stimulated by estrogen from the ovaries. And the functional layer, as we'll see over a 9-day period, gets thicker and thicker and thicker, almost a 1/4 inch thick at its maximal thickness. So, during menses, when a girl is on her period, this bloody discharge phase, the cells of the stratum functionalis die. And as they do, they slough off the sides of the uterus into the uterine cavity, along with some blood, and the dead endometrial cells of the stratum functionalis and blood then flush out of the uterus and into the vagina, where typically they would be absorbed by a tampon placed in the vagina. So this is a picture of the internal organs of the female reproductive tract. And this would be the vagina that leads to the uterus. And off the uterus would be the fallopian tubes that extend to the ovaries. The uterus has a fundus, body, and cervix. And the uterine wall consists of a perimetrium, myometrium, and endometrium. So this would be the stratum basale, which is the basal layer. And we're going to find that the ovaries during each menstrual cycle secrete a steroid hormone called estrogen. And estrogen will stimulate the basal cells to divide by mitosis and thicken up into, I'm not going to draw it all the way around, the stratum functionalis. So the stratum functionalis layer grows out from the basal cells when the basal cells are stimulated by estrogen from the ovaries. We're going to go into this in more detail on the next video. And then what we're going to find is that at some point in time, the cells of the functional layer actually die and slough off into the uterine cavity where they mix with blood and then flush out of the uterus into the vagina, where typically they would be absorbed as a bloody discharge by a tampon. So the functional layer grows out and then it's shed, and it's shed all the way back to the basal cells, and then the basal cells grow the functional layer again. The basal cells are never shed during menses, but the cells that make up the functional layer are shed during menses. So every menstrual cycle, the basal cells grow a functional layer that's shed, and it's shed all the way back to the basal cells. And then we repeat again and again and again with every menstrual cycle. With every menstrual cycle, the basal cells grow a functional layer that is shed all the way back to the basal cells. And then the basal cells in the next menstrual cycle grow the functional layer again. The vagina is also known as the birth canal. It's 3 to 4 inches in length and lined with non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The vagina has several functions. One, it carries the menstrual discharge from the uterus to the vagina, where it can be absorbed into a tampon that would be changed on a regular basis. Secondly, like the penis, it is a copulatory organ. Copulation means sexual intercourse. And the vagina receives the penis during intercourse, which allows for the transfer of sperm from a guy's body into a female's. And finally, the vagina is known as the birth canal because the newborn baby that developed over a 9-month period within the uterus has to pass through the vagina on its way out into the end of the world. Just before I leave the vagina, I want to just emphasize one more time that the vaginal fluids have an acidic pH that inhibits sperm motility, or the ability of sperm to swim well. And the semen, with a pH of around 7.4, which is alkaline, mixes with the vaginal fluids and brings the pH up to around 6, which is the optimal pH for sperm to swim vigorously and to track or swim in a straight line. They need to be able to do that to get from the vagina through the uterus and then up into the fallopian tubes. And by the way, it apparently is a perilous journey, because despite that, literally hundreds of millions of sperm cells come into the vagina with ejaculated semen. probably only thousands of sperm cells would make it into each oviduct to fertilize the egg that had been ovulated by either the right or the left ovary. The vagina is lined with ridges known as rugae, and they help to generate friction against the glands of the penis during sexual intercourse, which helps to trigger or move the male sexual response to emission and then finally ejaculation. I went over the external accessory organs, and I want you to know those from lab. So I don't intend to do it now. But there is an area found externally on females called the vulva, and it consists of the mons pubis, the labial folds, as well as the vestibule. The vestibule in turn includes the urethral orifice, vaginal orifice, and the clitoris. I did want to mention that the clitoris, curiously enough, contains two erectile columns. They're the corpora cavernosa, like we see in guys. And these erectile columns will engorge with blood as the clitoris becomes erect when the clitoris is physically stimulated. I'm going to finish up by going over the mammary gland or the breast. I guess you all are aware that humans, like many other animals, are mammals. That's how we'd be classified because we have mammary glands and feed our young with milk. So I do want you to know the basic anatomy of the breast that I covered in lab. But just to reiterate, this would be a breast, and the areola, whoops, looks like I didn't finish this, is the pigmented area around the nipple. The nipple is also known as the teat. So there are probably 8 or 10 lactiferous ducts that go up to lobules within the breast. And each of these lactiferous ducts would have an opening in the teat. So if you follow one of these openings down the lactiferous duct, you eventually come to the lobules within the breast that are lined by glandular epithelial cells. And it's these glandular epithelial cells in a lactating mother. It's a mom who gave birth to a kid and is breastfeeding her child. It's these glandular epithelial cells that secrete a lactational fluid. Most don't call it a lactational fluid, but I do want you to know that name. They would call it breast milk, or simply milk. And the breast milk or milk then travels down the lactiferous ducts through an opening in the teat or the nipple into the mouth of a suckling infant. So these glandular epithelial cells are dormant for most of the life of a female. They don't become active until a baby is born. By the way, if you dissected out or looked internally at a male breast, it would have the same configuration. But male breasts, because of hormone differences and the fact that males aren't going to give birth, never have glandular epithelial cells that are active and forming milk. So it turns out that estrogen from the ovaries in females will stimulate the formation of fat molecules, those would be triglycerides, in adipocytes beneath the skin of the breast. And the result of increased deposition of fat in adipocytes or fat cells beneath the skin of the female breast is that the female breast has more fat tissue associated with it, and as a result is larger than the male breast. The last topic that we cover in this section of the course before we have our test 3 is endocrinology, or the study of hormones. And I did want to mention a couple hormones now, because these are hormones associated with lactation. And lactation is the production of breast milk by the breast after a kid is born. So there are two peptide hormones. Peptide hormone is one that's constructed of a chain of amino acids that control lactation, or the production of milk and the delivery of milk into the mouth of a suckling infant. And these two peptide hormones are secreted from the pituitary gland. One is called prolactin, the other oxytocin. So let me just show you a picture of the pituitary gland, one that we looked at in a previous lecture. This would be the hypothalamus of the diencephalon of the brain. And extending from the hypothalamus is the pituitary stalk, or infundibulum. That attaches to the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland has an anterior or front portion and a posterior or rear portion. So prolactin is abbreviated PRL, and it's a hormone that's secreted by the anterior portion of the pituitary gland, and it stimulates the glandular epithelial cells of the lobules within the breast to make milk. And these cells then would fill up with milk as a result. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is abbreviated OXT, and it's secreted by the posterior pituitary. It stimulates the glandular epithelial cells to release their milk into the ducts, where it then can flow through openings at the end of the lactiferous duct in the nipple into the mouth of a kid who is breastfeeding. So there's two different hormones that regulate the production of milk. That's prolactin. And notice the name, PRO, for promotes the formation of a lactational fluid. And oxytocin actually stimulates the glandular epithelial cells to secrete the milk into the duct system, where it can flow into the mouth of a kid.